Okay, so this is a review of ideal answers for the quiz that you took last week. The first question asked you about the differences between the northern, middle, and southern colonies. And a good place to start would be with the climate and the soil, because a lot will follow from that. You can just hit pause and read the different categories here. And then what follows from that is, because the soil is not great in the north, there isn't as much work to do, so there's less of a need for slaves. And that makes sense because the people who settled the north primarily did so for religious freedom. There are some folks who are looking for a greater opportunity, but if that was the case, you would probably head more toward the middle colonies or the southern colonies. You can't grow tobacco, for instance, in the north. It doesn't make sense to do that, and the fishing is not as good in the south as it is up around Cape Cod, for instance. So the economy follows from the soil, and you can't grow rice anywhere else but the south, for instance. And then that drives the number of slaves that would come in. The motivations of people who are coming, it would be good to mention William Penn, and it might be good to mention some of the Catholics who came in to Maryland. And then early on in Jamestown, folks are coming primarily to make money. People who come later are somewhat religious, but it's harder to get together in the South because these crops are grown on plantations, and there aren't really plantations up in the north. And then down here, relations with natives are pretty poor across the board. A couple of exceptions. Roger Williams in Rhode Island has pretty good relations with Native Americans, and William Penn in Pennsylvania also has pretty good relations with Native Americans. So to the extent you had the material on this chart and were able to weave it together and make connections between the different cells of the chart there, the more points you would get for that question. So the second question asks, why did the colonists change from loyal subjects to people who rebel between 1763 and 1776, which is when the Declaration of Independence was passed? A nice point that some people made is that a third of the people did not rebel. They stayed loyal to the crown, and those people are called loyalists. So that would be a good point to mention. But the ones who did rebel did so for several reasons. One is geography. Because they're far away from England, they're able to do things that are independent of England and to sort of run matters on their own. Also, the folks who would choose to cross the Atlantic to start a new life have a streak of adventure and independence. Another is their experience with colonial legislatures. They're used to running their own affairs, and a lot of the leaders of the new country are going to get their experience in the colonial legislatures. These are sort of like the colonial legislatures represent sort of the minor leagues of running a government. You're still under Great Britain, but you're doing a lot on your own. And again, you're far away. The end of salutary neglect is a big factor. People have an expectation of being allowed to rule themselves, and that expectation is thwarted when salutary neglect ends. The question asked you specifically to define salutary neglect, so here's a pretty good definition down here. It's the unofficial policy of Great Britain not to strictly enforce laws and taxes. They would enforce them, but not that strictly in the North American colonies. And then this is the key point here. You got to get the because in there. Why would they stop doing that? You can't just leave it at that's the policy. It's because they were getting enough money from the colonies and there weren't any problems. It was a good trade partner for them. It was making Europe, England specifically, wealthier. Finally, the Enlightenment is a big deal. The idea that we don't need kings and that people can run their own governments. There's a great power in reason. And again, if you haven't watched that 4-minute video and looked over the notes on the Enlightenment, you should do that. This Enlightenment idea will spread to France and also to Latin America in the early 1800s. Where can you have gotten this information from? Well, we read and annotated and talked a bunch about this document called American Revolution Causes. I've sent you a link to it, but you should have it in your notes already. And we used this for our activity we did where we had people represent either loyalists or rebels. And So I was expecting you to be reasonably familiar with this document. Let me zoom in on it for a sec here. It says the American Revolution began in 1775 as an open conflict, and no one event can be pointed to the actual cause of it, but the war was a disagreement over the way that Great Britain treated the colonies. And that was different from the way the colonies felt they should be treated. They wanted more independence, more rights, more of the things they had back under salutary neglect. And so there's this Enlightenment idea of the consent of the governed, and so taxation without representation is taxing people without getting their consent. And if we scroll down this document a little bit more, these are the things that would have gotten you full credit on the quiz: the geographic considerations, the colonial legislatures, and again, I'm not going to read this to you. You can just hit pause on the video and read this, or read it in the document yourself. Salutary neglect, we've talked about a bunch, and then the Enlightenment. And as we'll see, the ideas from the Enlightenment, limited government, consent of the governed, and separation of powers are embedded in the U.S. Constitution, which we'll start looking at later this week. So some of the major events, the French and Indian War would be crucial to mention, that all the debt that comes from that leads to wanting more revenue from the colonies, and so they stop the salutary neglect and they start the taxing. They also passed the Proclamation Line, which we've talked about, that ticks off the colonists because they wanted to expand further west and thought the war was being fought for that reason. Sugar Act, Currency Act, committees of correspondence, people start writing to one another, they start getting organized. And that's another reason that would help explain why they rebel. It's hard for one person to rebel, but it's easier for a group to do so. And this is the first example of colonists getting together from different colonies and saying, hey, we share these grievances or these problems with Great Britain. Quartering Act, we've talked about, not fun to have people in your house having to feed them. Stamp Act would have been really good to mention. We talked about that in class. And we also talked about what followed from the Stamp Act Congress, another example of colonists coming together from different colonies, in this case 9 of them, meeting in New York City and saying, hey, this is what we're going to do to combat the Stamp Act. The Stamp Act is repealed by Great Britain in response to what they do at the Stamp Act Congress. So you'd think the colonists would be feeling good, maybe there wouldn't be a revolution, but then Britain issues a declaratory act that says we can pass any laws or taxes that we want, so it's clear salutary neglect is not coming back, and the colonists are pretty annoyed about that. And again, you can hit pause and read this, or read it in the document. Sons of Liberty are some people who organize again. The Townshend Acts, more attempts at taxes. There's some smuggling that goes on, and again, not following authority is a good precursor to actually rebelling against authority. Boston Massacre, people dying is not a good thing. There wasn't that many. I'm not sure it would qualify as a massacre, but it's used that way as propaganda, and we looked at that engraving that Paul Revere made. And let me pull that up for a second. Right, this is showing the British attacking the colonists, and you feel bad for the colonists. You got some blood coming out of some of them there. And so that is effective as propaganda. About 3 years later, the British passed a Tea Act, and in response, there's the Boston Tea Party, throwing the tea overboard. The response from Great Britain is something called the Intolerable Acts, and they outlaw town meetings and close the Boston Harbor. So folks are not psyched about that. And as we'll see when we look at the Bill of Rights, let me pull up the First Amendment for a second here. So this is the text of the First Amendment, and the first part of it talks about establishing a religion or prohibiting the free exercise of religion. Excuse me, we'll talk about that part later on, but you can't abridge or lessen, restrict the freedom of speech or of the press, or this is the one that came almost directly out of the Intolerable Acts. People should have the right peaceably to assemble, right? You can't throw rocks necessarily, but you can peaceably assemble and petition the government for a redress of grievances. That's a fancy way of saying, to say, hey, these are the problems we have. What are you the authority that we, as enlightened people, have given our consent. We've given you the consent that you're going to govern us. How are you going to redress or fix our problems? So that comes directly out of the experience from the Intolerable Acts, I think. The response to the Intolerable Acts is the First Continental Congress. And again, this is colonists getting together to organize. They boycott British goods. And then the fighting actually starts. So the question asked what events happened up till 1776. It would be good to mention that they're already at war. And part of the reason people would fight is to help some of their relatives who would be fighting and their friends. The Second Continental Congress, that wasn't crucial for this question, but that is what is going to create the Articles of Confederation, which we'll be talking about this week in class, or we've already talked about. Thomas Paine is also a good part of the answer, but we hadn't studied Thomas Paine when you took the quiz, so I wouldn't expect that to be in the answer, but read that through, and we've talked a bunch about Thomas Paine. And then this at the end, again, is that loyalist idea. Only a third of the colonists were in favor of the rebellion. A third continued to side with the British. That makes them the loyalists. And the last third were neutral. They weren't sure if they wanted to break away from Great Britain. So this 5-page document had everything you needed. You wouldn't include all the details from there, but again, the more details you would have, the better. And having a cause and effect chain would be a really good thing to do. So let me show you what I mean by that. So we start with an act. This is the Stamp Act passed by the British. Sorry about the jump there, but the colonial response is the Stamp Act Congress. We're meeting, we don't like the Stamp Act, we want to figure out how to respond to it. The British respond by repealing the Stamp Act. So it seems like, okay, that's reasonable. They're hearing our grievances, and this relationship could be okay. But then the British passed the Declaratory Act, which upsets the colonists, and again gets them to start to organize and say, we need to do stuff against the British. And that results in the Sons of Liberty, more colonial organization that's going to lead eventually to them rebelling. So act, reaction, another reaction from the British, silly reaction from the British that isn't really helpful, not necessarily silly, but they're asserting their power, and then the colonists respond with more organization. So again, the more of this you had in your answer, the better. So for homework, what I'd like you to do is write a few sentences about what you learned from this video. Hopefully there are some things that got clarified for you. How could your answer that you've written have been stronger? Or some things you might have included. And then how could you better prepare for a test or a quiz in the future? So write those things out in your notes, and also write a few sentences about what you're noticing about the election, and we'll talk about the election results and this video when we meet